If you have an upcoming interview, then this is the perfect video for you. Here are the 4 key things to remember to help you ace your next interview. Hi, I'm Laura, a PM working in tech, and on my channel I cover my life working as a PM, my life working in tech, and other computer science related advice. Generally speaking, the more practice you get, the better you'll be, and interviewing is no different. But hopefully these 4 tips will help speed up your process and also make you feel a little bit more confident going into your next interview. The first thing to keep in mind is to work through your thought process. Especially for coding interviews or LeetCode-like interviews, people really have the connotation that if you can just solve the problem and blaze through it, then you're really set. However, I'd argue a little bit differently. Of course, at the end of the day, solving the problem is going to be the most important part of the assessment because it shows that you have the technical depth and knowledge to actually solve the problem. But I think the next important thing is actually being able to communicate and explain the steps that you took to actually get there. If you have a great stellar candidate who can't communicate but solve the problem versus someone who maybe solved the problem a little bit suboptimally but did a great job explaining, I would bet in 9 out of 10 cases people are going to hire the person who solved it a little bit suboptimally but was able to do a great job explaining the thought process and how they got to where they are, as well as open a conversation of how they could have made the solution more optimal after the fact. I also think that communication is a really underrated skill, generally speaking, when it comes to early in career folks. I think what really helps to ground this is to remember that your interviewer is coming from a completely different headspace than you are. They have vastly different amounts of experience, and the way that you solve a problem can maybe be a little bit unintuitive, unorthodox, or unconventional, and the better that you can actually explain and catch the interviewer up to speed on how you're solving the problem, the quicker they'll be to be on your side and also be able to ask clarifying questions to help them understand what you're doing. I think that this really goes hand in hand as well with the next tip of always having a good structure in place to answer any question you might face. If you're walking through something that you're familiar with, your answer will come like it's second nature, and if you're tackled with something that's a little bit more unfamiliar or new to you, then you always have the structure to fall back upon to make sure you're hitting all the key points, regardless of what the question is and what the interviewer has asked you that may catch you off guard in the first place. For any technical problem, I think a great framework goes something like this. Firstly is to clarify the problem statement. Of course, repeat the question back to the interviewer to make sure that you absolutely got all the key words and are understanding and tackling the same problem that they've asked you in the first place. This is also the time to ask any clarifying questions such as input limits, restriction, and certain test cases that you may want to follow at the end of this process. Second is to come up with a brute force solution. Even if for whatever reason you already know the most optimal solution to the problem, it never hurts to start from the ground up, or at least checking in with the interviewer here. You can say something like, "Hey, I know the optimal solution, but would you like me to go through the process of a brute force solution and go through optimizing it with you?" Third step is to do an explicit check-in with the interviewer and ask if you're ready to write the actual code out. Thus far, you should really only be working with pseudocode to save yourself time unless your interviewer has explicitly asked otherwise. Having this checkpoint here helps make sure that, again, you two are on the same page, solving the same problem, and tackling the right things in your solution. The fourth step is then to actually write out your solution in code and work to optimize it if you don't already have the optimal solution. Again, communicating your thought process here is going to be super important because it gives you the chance to actually demonstrate that you have a lot of technical knowledge and you can talk about the trade-offs and constraints in your solution or in the problem itself. The fifth step is to then run through any test cases, whether ones that you've self-generated or have been given to you through the interviewer or also just self-generated through the platform. Then lastly is to do an explicit check-in again to ask any further questions and see if the interviewer has any more follow-ups for you. Although this process makes the most sense for an algorithmic or LeetCode style question, I think that generally it can be broadened to apply to most, if not all, technical interviews. For the product side of interviews, your process is also going to look a little bit different. Of course, first you're still going to clarify the problem statement, repeat it back to the interviewer, and make sure that you're on the same page. In PM interviews, it's also super important to use this first step to really ask and clarify all the details down to exactly what you're going to be solving for. You may be asked a very, very general question such as design a refrigerator, and you're going to really need to scope down into who you're designing for and the kinds of expectations that your interviewer may have diving into the problem. Now, the second step is to then take the target user group and define them into different segments of who you might be tackling. For example, if you're designing an education software product, you may be targeting teachers, but it's also important to think about the segmentation of individual teachers. There's going to be elementary school teachers all the way up through high school teachers, and also special education teachers or ESL, English as Second Language teachers, that may have slightly different needs and expectations out of the software. Having that clarity and granularity of detail is always great and an important second step in this process. Third is that once you have all the granular details solved, then you can then dive into individual pain points for each of these segmented users. Fourth is to do an explicit check-in with the interviewer and see if they have a particular request, user, pain point, or something that they want you to dive into. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and pick whichever one I feel most passionate about. From there, I'll probably craft a handful of different solutions, spitballing them and seeing if there's anything that the interviewer would like me to run with, or again, just choosing whichever one I feel has the most potential or that I enjoyed the most. Sixth and last is to then follow up on the solution. Are there any metrics, follow-up questions, or clarifying questions that the interviewer has for you? If so, then dive on in, and otherwise you've done a hopefully pretty good job of explaining your solution and your design to the interviewer. Lastly, for behavioral questions such as tell me about a time or tell me about when you did X, Y, and Z, you're going to want to follow the good old STAR method. Situation, task, action, and result. You're really only going to want to spend 2 to 4 sentences for each S, T, A, and R, and that's going to be a great format to have a good length answer, while also making sure you provide enough context, details, but not get bogged down by the overall history of everything going on at that moment in time. The third tip is to practice your answers, even if it's just to yourself. Practice is going to be super critical to help give you an air of confidence when it comes to answering questions, and also just reduce a little bit of your stress in the interview process. You've probably heard tons about setting up mock interviews, and yes, mock interviews are going to be a fantastic way to replicate the kind of stress and environment that you'll be in for an interview and just get your mind focused in the interview setting. It's basically priming. You're putting yourself into the same scenarios that you're going to expect in a real interview to help these things come more easily to you next time, and also just to get more confident in those kinds of similar scenarios, even if they are a little bit stressful. But if you can't happen to schedule a mock interview, it's still going to be worthwhile and worth your time to practice some of your answers out loud to make sure that you have your bases covered and that you feel confident speaking about yourself and responses to some of these common questions that interviewers may ask. We all know the feeling that, especially when it comes to that first interview of the season or your first interview ever, you get a little bit jittery, scared, and nervous about if you're answering the right questions or saying the right things. And that's why you also hear a lot of advice to save your favorite companies for later in the interview process. At the very least, you probably don't want to be interviewing with your favorite or dream company right off the bat, fresh out of not interviewing after a couple of months. Practice can also take the form of an Excel spreadsheet where you list out all of the common questions and your expected stories for each of these questions. A great way to get started with this is using Amazon's 14 key principles, because those have a wide range of questions that can cover any type of behavioral question you might expect to be asked. Fourth and last is to not be afraid of asking for a moment of silence to think. Interviews are stressful. You don't always have the right thing prepared for the given interview, scenario, or situation. People also just don't do well under pressure, and it puts a lot of stress on your brain to come up with the right thing to say. This is totally normal. You can do all the preparation in the world for one company, but every company is going to interview different, and you can get asked a really niche question that you're just not prepared for or taken off guard by. If you do get caught off guard, don't have a story lined up, or are just struggling to think of the right solution, just breathe and ask the interviewer for a moment to think. No one's going to judge you for it, especially if it does help you get unstuck or recover your thought process, and I guarantee you that those couple of moments are going to be invaluable in the long run to your success if you do actually use these to your advantage. During all my PM interviews, I usually ask for a couple of minutes just to think and focus when it comes to the solutioning part and coming up with features or ways to solve the user pain points for a given design problem. I find that having those notes, whether written or on the screen for me, are really helpful to help organize my thoughts, and it helps me deliver a more fluent answer otherwise if I was just going off the top of my head. When it comes to technical interviews, again, it's okay to ask for a couple minutes if you're optimizing a solution or actually just writing out the code. Yes, talk through your thought process and don't just jump from point A to B, but you also don't have to be spewing out a stream of consciousness at every given moment during all 30 minutes or hour of your interview. So those are 4 interview tips that I think you don't hear enough about that I really wanted to bring to the top of your attention if you have an upcoming interview or interviews scheduled. As always, if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, schedule a coffee chat with me at ak.ms/chatwithlaura, or join my Discord channel and ask any questions in any appropriate forum. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again for a brand new video. Bye!
Every year right around June 21st,